So welcome back, everybody. This is Paul again, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about homesteading and the things that you really need on a homestead to make it successful and productive. And I made another list earlier about 10 important things that you need, and I have 10 more at least on this list here, so I'll share them with you. Basically, on a homestead, typically if you buy something out in the countryside, you'll be surprised that it might be very dark. You need lights. A lot of people buy land, they go, the first time it comes down to the nightfall, they go, whoa, it's pretty dark out here, there's no street lights. Now, it's been a country practice for many years in some areas. Like I sold a lot a couple of years ago, and it had a mobile home on it, and they actually, the old style was we give you one street light by your house, okay, because they know that the people out in the countryside, it's pretty darn dark out there. So a lot of the old style, they had one post on the property that had a light that, unless you shoot it out, it'll be on most of the time at night because it has an automatic on feature. Now, you may not have that on your property, probably won't in the beginning. So basically, you're going to need some way of having some light. I suggest some headlamps and some flashlights and some lanterns and so on, because way out in the country it gets really dark, and a lot of people who had homesteads, they know that for sure. So that's just one thing to remind you, that you're going to need different kinds of lighting, and there's a lot of different various kinds of lighting systems that you get into for different purposes, but you're definitely going to need light out there. A survey and boundaries. If you can get a property that has a survey already, it's not that common. I run into it now and then in real estate business, that there is a property that has a recent survey, but typically the survey it costs money to do it, and a lot of times it was done a long time ago. And some of the old survey records, I saw a property recently, the last survey was 1943. That's a long time. Now, what matters is that if you're on adjacent to, it could be some other person's property, or it could be a municipal property, it could be something like a public property, like a park, or if you're near a forest or something, national forest, there's a property line, and you can get into some serious issues by if you put a driveway or some kind of, you chop down a tree that's on somebody else's lot that's 50 feet over the line. So there's some issues that you can get, and it's really important to get and at least an idea of where the property lines are. Now, in some cases, there's places where there's sort of a grandfathered in, where I sold a property last year where for years and years and years there's a bridge over this one creek that gets to the property, and it was like 50 feet onto another person's. Technically speaking, if it was really, you really want to get down to it, it was really not quite on its own property, but it had been grandfathered in and used for so long that basically, for all practical purposes, that's called I don't know, an easement or whatever, but nobody really, wasn't an issue. But in some cases, you can really get into an issue with the property line, and so you want to know where that is on your property. Especially now, typically on a stream, the property line in the old days, it used to go to where the middle of the stream was. That's typically where the property line goes. But over the years, a stream will vary, and by survey exactly, then the line might not be on the middle of the stream anymore because the stream has moved. But at the same time, the general rule of thumb is, if the property line was intended to be on the stream, in the middle of the stream at that point, it's still there. That's the way it works basically in real estate. So, because the stream moves, and we all know that happens, and you can't do anything about it really. First aid kit. If you live out in the country, have some first aid stuff. Just get some books on first aid, some bandages, all the basic stuff. You can buy kits and so on. That's really helpful. And also find out what the wildlife is around your neighborhood, because there are people who are not familiar with bears. Where I live, now and then we get bears, and I see them, and they turn over the garbage can now and then, and you have to learn how to put a chain on the garbage can, and you know, just got to do what you got to do with animals. You got maybe possums or snakes can be an issue, but typically the snakes try to mind their own business. You'll see that most of the snakes, at least in Virginia, are not dangerous, but they can scare you anyway. Because a black snake will get pretty big, and they may be really big, but they're not really poisonous. They eat a lot of rodents. And actually, some kinds of the wildlife, if you know what the wildlife is around your property, you kind of expect certain things, like raccoons and so on. Now, possums, I never bother them. They eat the cat food, and dogs come, and coyotes come, and now and then you get a bear walking across the property, and deer, and so on. Another thing you'll find out is in the countryside, now and then, some livestock, some cattle will get out of their fence, and you'll see them kind of walking down the road, or so on. So it's something to be aware about the country. The local resources. It's important to know the local resources. There's places to take out trash. There's people who will come and work on your driveway or clear some timber for you. There's a lot of county resources for farming and helping farmers, and a lot of these counties, they really would like to encourage agriculture because, for example, in Virginia, agriculture, timber, and cattle and so on is a very huge industry. It's a very big producing state. So there are in place certain organizations and things that you can get helpful information about your property, your water test, and so on. So all those resources good to be aware of when you live out in the country, because that's how a community out in the countryside works. People work together and they have certain knowledge of the area and so on. So you know who's got the bulldozer when you need one, and who's got the well digger when you need one, and so on. So those local resources are important. A compost pile. A lot of people don't think about that, but you're going to do a lot of trimming on your property, and so you might as well start a compost pile, because over the years the compost will build up and you can use it for your soil and have really some of the best soil for your garden. And you're going to need to get rid of some of the trimmings, so it's good to have that. Also a fire pit. Typically in the countryside, when you do a lot of trimming and things keep growing, you got to trim. So you can burn outdoors in an open area and have a fire pit and all that. So those simple things that you might not think about when you buy a piece of property, but get yourself a little fire pit and a compost pile, because you're going to need it. Also a place to store some materials, because if you have rocks, for example, on your property that you might want to use, or soil or something, you might want to put those aside for a while. Maybe you cut down some logs or something and you want to put them aside for a while. You can organize an area on the property where you're going to put some storage of those kind of materials and keep them out of the weather. Sometimes under a tree might be good or so on, but that's something to think about when you have a property, is where you're going to store your tools. Again, a shed. Any kind of storage that you can have on a piece of property, even if you buy raw land, build some kind of shed, some place to put your tools, to lock some things up. I watched this video about this guy who grew up with his dad building houses, and they started with their own property. The first thing they did was they lived in this basically really primitive shelter while they built their first house. It developed into a career for him. He went on to build all kinds of custom homes and fancy log homes and so on. But he started with just build a shelter. The adventure of getting some land and starting out like the old pioneers, they had to just basically make their own shelter just to even start there. So nowadays you can buy all kinds of nice sheds. You can have them delivered, 10 by 12, 12 by 18. You can get a shed delivered. It may be not your final home, but if you're in a warm climate and you get one of these, like a 12 by 20 shed or something, put on your property, you can probably make a comfortable little place there for a while, and at least have a base. When you come to visit your property and do work on it, you used to have a shelter and a place to get out of the rain and so on. So that's another thing. One thing that comes up in a lot of discussions about homesteading is the actual use of a gun on a property. I'll tell you, in Virginia, it's a long history of gun ownership, and frankly, I bet everybody on my road has a gun of some kind, but you hardly ever see him. In fact, I'm told the neighbor has 100 guns, and he's a collector, and he's involved in the reenactments of the Civil War things that he can fire the cannon. So he's very responsible. A lot of his friends are policemen, and he has a lot of guns. Now and then in the countryside, it's very common to hear people shooting and target practicing and so on, and nobody bats an eye about it. Now, I personally am not a hunter, but the fact of having a gun, there's a lot of different possible reasons why. For example, if you see a rabid animal, they're going to die a horrible death, and they're terribly infectious, and you have to put them out of their misery. An animal that's like a raccoon or something that's rabid, you really have to kill that thing, unfortunately. And there are situations, I ran into a situation some years ago when I saw a rabbit that had been partly bitten by a fox or something, and it was dying, and the maggots were, I took care of it just because there are certain situations that you might want to use a gun for. Now, self-defense is a whole big thing, and I'm not an expert in that, and there's plenty of people out there who will give you some really professional advice on using a gun. I frankly live where I live in the country. Hardly anybody ever, we don't have crime out here. They're just, the people, they just aren't the kind of people who come and raid your house. It's just the way it is. People live their tractors and their mowers out, and it's sort of a civil thing living in the country. I'm not going to steal your stuff. Now and then in some areas there are people who maybe have some drug problem or whatever, and they just, young people usually, and they'll steal a chainsaw or some tools or something like that. But generally speaking, in terms of violent crime and that kind of robbery stuff, you just don't experience it out there in the country. A lot of people who want to conduct those kind of crimes will get lost out here in the country. So they may commit their crime, but they'll get lost getting away. So this really doesn't happen much out here. But as far as wildlife, there is a really good reason. If you eat meat, you might as well shoot something if you have to. There are wildlife out there. There's plenty of deer out there. There's squirrels and so on, and fish and things that you can eat. And typically, for centuries, actually, people have lived that way. They lived off the land to some extent. They get some food from their land and from the neighborhood. So having a gun is a really, I think, basically a personal decision. But if I would get one, I would get something that you can really get trained on and manage properly, and keep it in a safe place and locked up, and learn how to use it. For all practical purposes, a small shotgun, a 20 gauge shotgun, and a 22 rifle will do a lot in the countryside. If you really need to do something and kill a deer or something, then you got, but there are ways to live out in the country and not have a weapon, but it's better to have some kind of protection of some kind, and your safety. Also, some locks and basically security things that you might need in the countryside is another important thing to have in your homestead. So thanks again for listening. I appreciate it very much, and please like and share. Once again, my name is Paul. I'm a country realtor in Virginia. I'm licensed, and I've been in the business for a while, and my specialty is homesteading and recreation and investment type of property. So feel free to call me. I'm happy to do some scouting for people and do some looking around and answer any questions about buying and selling real estate. So thanks again, and hope to see you in some of my other videos.